Now, India is hosting the G20 foreign ministers meeting. Fractured East-West relations over the conflict in Ukraine and increasing concerns about China's global aspirations are set to dominate the meeting. The meeting is particularly crucial for India's hopes to use its chairmanship of the group to leverage its position on the global stage and adopt a neutral stance on Ukraine. After a welcome dinner yesterday, the main meetings will be held today. India wishes to focus on issues of importance to developing nations like rising inflation, debt stress, health, climate change, and food and energy security. However, the split over the invasion of Ukraine and its impact on global energy and food security is predicted to overshadow the proceedings. The antagonism has left G20 host India in the position of trying to reconcile clearly irreconcilable differences. Now, the meeting is being attended by 40 delegations, including those headed by the Russian Foreign Minister, the US Secretary of State, the Chinese Foreign Minister. Russia says it will use the meeting to tell the world who, as per Moscow, is responsible for the political and economic crises the world finds itself in. Germany says it will counter Russian propaganda, and the United States has underlined that it is important to call out Moscow. EU says Russia must be made to understand that the war in Ukraine has to end. Lavrov will be attending and will be seated with the delegation from the UAE and East Asian countries. India has declined to blame Moscow for the war, seeking a diplomatic solution, and has boosted its purchases of Russian oil. Remember, India has also abstained from voting in UN resolutions that condemn the Ukraine invasion. Yesterday, Lavrov and India's Foreign Minister S. Jaishankar held discussions in New Delhi. The meeting is also being watched for how tensions between Washington and Beijing play out. China has been backing a political solution to the war in Ukraine. Last month, the US shot down what it said was a Chinese surveillance balloon just off South Carolina after it spent days traveling across the country. The incident widened the diplomatic rift between the two countries. The US Secretary of State Antony Blinken has no plans to meet the foreign ministers of Russia and China. The British Foreign Secretary, James Cleverly, will meet the Chinese Foreign Minister on the sidelines. Cleverly said that he will like to support India in having a successful G20 presidency. For more on this, we're now being joined by our correspondent Susan Tehrani from New York, as well as principal diplomatic correspondent Siddhant Sibal from New Delhi. Thank you so much for joining us. Now, Siddhant, coming to you first, what can you tell us of the agenda for the day and the meets that have been planned?
Well, here I'm standing at the campus of the Presidential House, the Rashtrapati Bhavan here in Delhi, where in approximately 2 hours' time, the G20 Foreign Ministers meeting will begin. Now, the focus from India's side is reforming of the United Nations, counter-terrorism, development partnership, and issues like food security, the challenges erupting from the Russia-Ukraine conflict, something that undoubtedly is going to shadow the foreign ministers meeting. We saw in the finance ministers meeting as well in Bangalore how there was a divide between West and Russia, and we do expect similar situation here in Delhi. The big question, of course, is will there be a joint statement or India will issue a chair statement, something we saw in the finance ministers meeting in Bangalore.
Right. Susan, coming to you now, the split over the invasion of Ukraine, its impact on global energy, food security, it's predicted to overshadow the proceedings, as Siddhant mentioned as well. What can we expect?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the issue of the Ukraine conflict will definitely dominate this G20 summit, but it's very rare to see so many ministers from different nations really at the same spot like the G20. So I think that this is going to be a situation where these high-level delegations, the ministers and their accompanying delegations, are going to really take the opportunity to not only talk about the Ukraine conflict, but really the fallouts of the conflict, which again, goes to energy security, food security for other countries. And then really talk about moving forward. Well, on the surface, just last week at the United Nations, many really talked about the rule-based international order, notably the West, and how really ultimately a solution to this conflict would have to be based on the UN Charter. Behind closed doors, many of these ministers who were here in New York were casting doubt on how far Ukraine can really go moving forward without some kind of negotiated settlement. So I think what we'll be looking out for after these few days is whether or not these ministers will sit down and come up with some kind of realistic approach to the Ukraine conflict, or will they really stick to their guns and talk about that idealistic motto that they've had for the past year?
Right. Now, Siddhant, this meeting is particularly crucial for India's hopes to use its chairmanship of the group to leverage its position on the global stage. And of course, India's position on the Ukraine war has been clear since day one. What can you tell us?
Well, India's position on the conflict has been something reiterated multiple times, that dialogue and diplomacy is the only way forward. And Prime Minister Narendra Modi's famous comments that this is not an era of war has been reiterated several times now by Western leaders. Now, the big question is how India will be able to bridge the divide. India is in a very, very positive position in terms of Moscow and West. It has leverages both sides. And today will be the day when India's diplomatic test essentially will be taken as the world community and foreign ministers hold discussions, negotiations that will last almost a day. But essentially the focus will be for India's side is to be the voice of the global south as well. India will be putting on the table issues that impact global south, especially issues as we have been talking about erupting from the Russia-Ukraine conflict, the high inflationary pressures. In fact, the Bangladeshi foreign minister spoke to WION exclusively yesterday late night, in which he pointed how the conflict has been a major worry for his country and how the inflationary impact is something that is troublesome for the Bangladeshi government. So it is these countries who have been facing the brunt of the conflict, and it is these countries India will be representing at the high table later today.
Right. Of course, the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov will also has also held talks with Indian counterpart S. Jaishankar on bilateral cooperation and issues relating to G20. What can you tell us about that?
Well, we saw yesterday the meeting happening between the Indian External Affairs Minister and the Russian Foreign Minister, and the conversation basically was on how both countries can work together, especially at the United Nations. Also remember that amidst the conflict, India has now become one of the largest importer of Russian energy as well, something that we have seen critical voices coming from the West, but India of course is not perturbed by those comments. And essentially, while India is strengthening its relationship with Russia, especially in the defense and energy sector, the focus for India is to make sure that how India will be able to bridge the divide later today when the Russian foreign minister, the Chinese foreign minister will be face to face with many of their Western counterparts here at the Rashtrapati Bhavan.
Right. Susan, coming to you now, the meeting is also, of course, being very closely watched for how tensions between Washington and Beijing will play out. As I mentioned earlier, Secretary of State Antony Blinken will not be meeting China. What can you tell us? Well, we seem to be having a problem with that line. We will get Susan back with us. Moving on for now, we're also being joined by Raymond E. Vickery from Washington, D.C. Raymond is a senior associate, Wadhwani Chair in U.S.-India Policy Studies. Thank you so much for joining us on this broadcast.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Now, of course, as I'd mentioned earlier, Russia says that it will use this meeting to tell the world, as per Moscow, who is responsible for the multiple crises that the world is facing currently. What are you expecting on that front?
Well, I'm expecting that Russia is going to try to reverse reality. What they're going to try to say is basically they were threatened in such a way that that's caused this conflict. And of course, the reality is that a year ago, after telling the world that they were not going to invade, they invaded a sovereign nation, the Ukraine, with the intent of taking it over completely. That's the reality. War crimes were committed, particularly in the Bucha area, where Russian troops tortured and killed civilians. That's what the reality that has gone on. What's going on here is that President Putin has the old-time view of national power, and that he wants to reestablish the Russian Empire, which included Ukraine. It included 5 nations that Secretary Blinken has been to. So he's going to try to make some sort of argument that it's really all NATO's fault. Well, that's just not true. During the 90s, when I was in the Clinton administration, there was every attempt to include Russia really as a part of the decision-making in NATO. There was an enlargement of the G7 to include Russia.
Right.
Well, Putin came along, it was a different story.
Right. Of course, another important point here, as I mentioned earlier, the world is watching how tensions between, in fact, Washington and Beijing will pan out here. We've seen that China has been backing a political solution to the war in Ukraine. What can you tell us?
Well, I think that there are some good points in what China has put forward. A respect for the rule of law and the sovereignty of others. The not threatening of nuclear weapons. The problem is not what they say, but what they do. And when it comes to what they do, the closeness between China and Russia is apparent. They were the only 2 nations among the G20 to veto or not subscribe to the statement of G20 finance ministers. So, yes, there's something in that. Secretary Blinken has acknowledged that. But you must back up your words with actions. Thus far, that has not happened with China.
Right, absolutely. Of course, we know that the war in Ukraine is expected to dominate talks, and it will. But what about its impact on global energy, food security? Do you think we can see any fruitful action on that front?
Well, you know, when I was Assistant Secretary of Commerce, we took to heart the proposition that you cannot separate entirely the political, the security from the economic and the development aspects of international relations. It's impossible to say we're going to wage a war, we're going to cut off energy supplies, we are not going to allow grain to go out of Ukraine, we are not going to be able to supply or allow the supply of fertilizer, and at the same time make progress in regard to the political matters. So these things are related. I think there is some good that will come out of it, but India, like the U.S., is in a great position to be able to ameliorate what Russia is doing to restore the rule of law, but it cannot ignore that and just step up and buy all the cheap oil it can, to get fertilizer wherever it can, and to conduct business as usual. This is the great time, the great issue which is facing mankind. We're here on the World is One Network, WION, and it is absolutely essential that all the world understand that this division into north, south, east, west just does not work in an era of nuclear weapons and communications.
Right, absolutely. Well, India's position has been clear from day one, and it has always supported dialogue and diplomacy. That being said, Mr. Vikri, thank you so much for joining us on this broadcast with your insights on this.
Thank you very much for having me.
WION is now available in your country. Download the app now. Get all the news on the move.